Fanboy, 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 fanboy. The worst systems of the 90s. What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Fanboy Reviews Countdown. And today we're going to talk about the top 10 worst video game systems, consoles, and handhelds of the 90s decade. And most of these systems came out in the 90s, but we'll talk about some of the older ones too that basically had its run in the 90s. Alright, coming in at number 1, Virtual Boy. Oh man, this was awful. The Virtual Boy came out in 95 and lasted all the way through about 7 months and ended in 96. Basically, it was this very gimmicky pile of crap system from Nintendo. Typical Nintendo doing the gimmicky crap with trying to do something new, but it always falling flat on their faces. It had this eye-straining red monochrome graphics, so all it did was hurt your eyes. It only had 22 games, and only like 12 were released in North America. So you basically had this incredibly limited library of crappy games. The system cost around $180, and it sold, can you believe this, over 700,000 copies. That's right. So like 770,000 people actually were fooled. Poor souls that actually spent money and wasted that amount, nearly $200 on this pile of crap. Its worst games includes Wario Land, Mario's Tennis, and Mario Clash. So these are awful games and an awful system. Number 2, the Super Nintendo. That's right, the Nintendo SNES. This one came out in 1990, so right up there in the 90s. My goodness, it had terrible graphics, outdated 2D games that look terrible even to this day. Everything was 2D. It had no 2D, had no 3D rather, no 3D gameplay at all. Garbage looking. It had absolutely no RPGs. No role-playing titles. No fighting games. And you're talking about genres that were very popular in the 90s. There was really a lot of popular RPG stuff and fighting game stuff, but because it was Japanese, Super Nintendo didn't really accept those games. It was a little bit more action oriented and platforming. But apparently its worst games were, those genres of games. Worst games included Super Mario World, Donkey Kong Country, and Super Mario Kart, which is definitely one of the worst racing games of all time. Super Nintendo, absolute garbage. Alright, number 3, the PlayStation 1. That's right, the original Sony PlayStation came out in 1994. It had the worst 3D graphics I've ever seen, because it was just completely polygonal garbage. It looked like crap. Take a look at PS1 graphics right now, and it's just gonna make you freaking barf. I mean, it just looks so terrible. It's so it's makes your eyes hurt. There's nothing good about it. I mean, it just, no details, no good graphics, no lighting effects, just a pile of crap, really. It had the worst controller in the world, the DualShock. Ugh, this was a broken mess, the most flimsy controller in the world. It had no rumble, it had no, those sticks that is common now with the PS3 consoles. It didn't have those sticks, the DualShock sticks. It also had some of the worst games available in the 3D aspect. So Gran Turismo, Final Fantasy VII, Tekken 3. Just the worst games I've ever seen. Stay away from this system. One of the worst games and the worst systems in history. Alright, number 4, Game Boy Color. Ugh, the Game Boy Color, a GBC. This one came out in 1998 and supposed to be the the successor or the new version of the Game Boy, but it had awful lighting, so you couldn't really see anything. So it had dark graphics, almost no real colors. So it didn't actually have. It wasn't really colorful. It was just pretending to be colorful. You know, it wasn't. It didn't have an enormous palette of different colors. It was actually very bland, very basic. Crappy 2D graphics, of course. You know, very outdated look. It was basically like a handheld NES, and you know that looked like crap to begin with. GBC games, they didn't have backwards compatibility with the original Game Boy. That's right. So you couldn't play Game Boy Color games on the Game Boy, on the first one. So, I mean, what kind of garbage is that? Its worst games, the worst games include, well, the Pokemon series, Pokemon Gold, Silver, Crystal, and also the Legend of Zelda games. That's right, they had these crappy... It was basically, they tried to rip off Pokemon with a different versions, so they had Link's Awakening DX, Oracle of Ages, and Oracle of Seasons, which were basically the same games, but they had like slightly different versions. Oh, it was just a complete gimmick. Number 5, the Sega Dreamcast. Oh man, the Sega Dreamcast stinks. Came out in '98. Supposed to be like the 6th generation or something, but it was just, it had no longevity. Oh my goodness, it lasted like, what, a year at the most? Terrible launch games, very small library of games. You know, it didn't have a lot of good games at all. Awful internet connection. You could barely, I think it used like 56K modem back in the day, so I mean, talk about lag city. It rips off the PlayStation 2. Basically what they tried to do, Sega tried to rip off Sony, you know, with the PS2, and tried to rip off its graphics, try to, you know, have internet access and all that stuff, but just completely failed. The worst games for the Dreamcast includes Shenmue, Sonic Adventure, and Soul Calibur. Just utterly embarrassing. Number 6. The N64. That's right, Nintendo 64, released in 1996, like a whole freaking year after the PlayStation and the Saturn came out. The competition, so it was already way ahead. Kind of late to the party, Nintendo. There, you know, it had nothing but kiddie games, you know, little games for kids. Worst looking 3D graphics I've ever seen. It had this really annoying controller that got really sticky, and it was really broken. It was easy to break, basically. It had some of the worst wrestling games ever. You know, talk about No Mercies and Revenge and World Tour. You know, just awful wrestling games. And some of its other worst games are Mario 64, Mario Kart 64, Ocarina of Time. Just putrid, pathetic piles of crap. Alright, number 7, Sega Genesis. That's right, this one came out actually in the 80s. It's a 1988 system, but it lasted all the way through the 90s and had a bit of a presence. Oh, basically, this was just a rip-off of the SNES. You know, it was, yeah, that's right, it basically ripped off Nintendo, Super Nintendo, and tried to have these, like, you know, it had no characters. You know, they had really crappy characters and mascots. Completely unappealing, you know, not nearly as charismatic as its competition. Had this really stupid floppy controller design that didn't work. You know, it was completely flimsy. It had no online internet access, so you couldn't really go online with Sega Genesis. I mean, so what kind of pathetic garbage is that? You know, you're talking about the 90s here. You know, it's the era of the internet, and you're not going to be able to go online. I can't play Sonic Online? What kind of crap is that? And it was originally called the Mega Drive. That's right, the Sega Mega Drive. So, what are you gonna call it? You know, why do you keep switching names? Why do you keep switching titles? How can I trust a console if it's gonna keep changing names? What kind of weirdo is this? What kind of a weird thing? You know, you changing aliases all the time. You can't trust that kind of company. Its worst games include the Sonic the Hedgehog, the first one, Sonic the Hedgehog 2, and Aladdin. That's right, Disney's Aladdin. Awful games. Alright, number 8. The 3DO came out in 93. This was manufactured by Panasonic. Awful, unrecognizable games. It had nothing noteworthy. It was too expensive. It was like $600 when it came out. It wasn't a real 32-bit system. You know, it was basically a 2D system that tried to rip off like a 32-bit style, and it was kind of crappy. Worst games include The Need for Speed, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, and Road Rash. These games are just completely bad. There's a reason why these games aren't around anymore. You know, you're not gonna find these games anymore. Number 9. Sega Saturn. Oh my goodness, Sega Saturn sucked so bad. Came out in 94. It was only popular in North America. It actually didn't become popular in Japan, unfortunately, and that's why it only sold 9 million copies. And to put it into retrospect, Sega Saturn sold 9 million in total. You have video games now like Call of Duty and Grand Theft Auto selling like 10 million each copy. You know, each game sells like 10 million. So I mean, that shows you how crappy Sega Saturn was. Really didn't have any games worth talking about. Bad graphics, horrible console design. Basically tried to rip off the PlayStation. The worst games includes Virtua Fighter 2, Panzer Dragoon, all the Panzer Dragoon, you know, Saga, all that stuff, and Nights into Dreams, which are just the most unoriginal piles of trash. You know, Nights was so bad. Basically tried to rip off Mario 64. You know, it's pathetic. And number 10, to round out this list, worst systems of the 90s, PC. That's right, number 10 is PC. I mean, computer, basically. The computer was horrible in the 90s. You know, you're talking about like Windows 95, DOS, Windows 98, Macintosh. Nothing could run in those systems, man. I mean, you know, try and run Diablo 3 on a freaking Windows 98. It's not gonna work. It's so outdated. The graphics sucked so bad. You know, keep in mind this was at a time when there was no smartphones, no iPhones, no tablets. Barely had any online DLC content. Very slow and buggy gameplay. You know, horrible internet connection back then. Awful visuals and cinematics. You know, they didn't have good cinematics. It was very terrible cutscenes. You know, just garbage. Cartoonish, very cartoonish games. And the worst games, definitely games like StarCraft, Myst. Myst was bad, and Half-Life. Definitely some of the worst PC games ever. Alright, so that's it. These are the top 10 worst video game consoles of the 90s. Don't even think about them. You know, don't even praise them. Don't even look at them with, you know, some sort of nostalgic thing. It's not worth it. They sucked. You know, I mean, I was there. You know, I actually saw these systems. You know, these systems were so bad that they had nothing good. They were completely terrible. No good games. Terrible graphics. Just, you know, just stick to the current gen. I mean, the current gen is way better than the frickin' 90s. Alright, so that's it for this episode of Fanboy Reviews Countdown. And until next time, keep fanboying. Yeah!